The Republicans really wanted the majority in the House of Representatives, and we wanted them to have the majority in the House of Representatives, but we also promised you we keep an eye on those guys, so let's check in with one of our favorites. He represents the 1st Congressional District of Oklahoma, Congressman Kevin Hern, also, by the way, the chairman of the Republican Study Committee. Thanks for joining us, Congressman.
Larry, it's great to be with you.
Well, here you are a little into your second week now, I guess, now that you've got the speaker and leadership question out of the way. And give us a quick thumbnail. I mean, what did you guys get accomplished last week? And let's just be clear, I know that you got to have the Senate actually pass the things that you passed, but I still think it's an accomplishment to let the American people know what Republicans stand for. So based on that criteria, what do we stand for given last week's votes?
Well, clearly, thanks for having me, as always. First of all, you have to have your every member sworn in, both Democrat and Republican. So that all takes place. So now we're officially members of Congress. But what you're seeing from Republicans is what we promised, which is accountability of the executive branch. And you're seeing that now play out with Congressman Jim Jordan and Jamie Comer as they look into now what's ever present is the Biden's misuse of classified documents, and we're finding out after the election when this has been going on for a couple of months now. But you're going to see a lot of oversight on Department of Justice, on the FBI, what's going on there. You're also going to see a lot of work around fiscal responsibility and accountability, as we know this week. Secretary Yellen has said that the debt ceiling is fast approaching. And we've got to work to make sure we rein in, not only pay our debts, but rein in spending as we go forward. Yeah. So it's a twofold approach, and so a lot of work to do. Let's
talk about that debt ceiling. You're right, Secretary Yellen has said that if the debt ceiling has to be raised again if it doesn't cost taxpayers money. People still don't understand exactly what the debt ceiling is, and what's the point of having a so-called debt ceiling if all Congress does is continue to increase the debt ceiling and raise the debt ceiling? Also, one other question. I don't remember her giving these warnings when Nancy Pelosi was in charge of the House.
No, it's something that's pretty fascinating. Really, the debt ceiling is to raise the limit so that we can pay for the bills that we've already incurred. But it also is an indicator of what we do going forward. It's no different than your credit card. If you have to raise your credit card limit to pay for what you've already charged, but you don't rein in your spending, that's inevitable. You're going to continue to raise that. But we're spending close to $6 trillion a year now, and we're taking in about $4 trillion. So that creates a $2 trillion deficit every year, and it's escalating. And what we're seeing right now, certainly what we've seen since President Biden's been in office, is about $6 trillion in spending. And so it's way out of control, and we've got to use every opportunity we can to rein that in.
Congressman, you know that if you ask any American family the best way to live within their means and make sure that they don't take on stifling, crippling debt, it's to have a budget. You start with a budget, and then you figure out what your priorities are, and then you make sure that you try to adhere to that budget. When will we begin the standard, regular order budget process in the House of Representatives?
Well, Larry, thanks. As you know, I've been really big on the budgets the last 2 years, Republican Study Committee. I've chaired that committee. I've actually been the only member of Congress that's worked through a budget to balance. Last year was around 7 years. This year's a little over 7 because of the change in interest rates and the trajectory of the debt we're having. But, that's the promise that came out of the speaker's race, was to get a balanced budget on the floor. We've been challenged to help the House Budget Committee get to a balanced budget. Certainly, we've given the blueprint on the RSC how to get there. It's going to take tough decisions, but the American people are demanding, because as you just said, every American has to balance their budget. Every state, community, county has to balance their budget. Only the federal government doesn't have to balance their budget. And for the last 4 years since I've been in Congress, Nancy Pelosi hasn't even done a budget.
Yeah. Well, and what ends up happening, of course, which hopefully this process has been preempted by some of the new rules of the House that passed, is that a handful of powerful senators and congressmen get into a room, they reach out a deal, and then you all get your arms twisted to vote for it, or else. Gone are those days, Congressman?
Well, I would certainly like to think so. I think that we have to get to the most conservative appropriation bills as we possibly can. That starts with getting with the budget first. As the Republican Study Committee chair, we started last week with the CBO Director, Philip Swagel, bring him in to talk about the process. So many members of Congress don't have a clue how this process works, and so it's our job to help them become more knowledgeable. So as we walk through this process together, we can understand how it works. It's also about having tremendous input on the appropriation bills, and that was another thing that came out of the Speaker's race, was able to get amendments on the floor of the House of Representatives, something that has been done since 2016, on the appropriation bills and send those appropriation bills with instructions to the Senate that if you don't pass it, we'll do a continuing resolution, which will hold spending flat as we go into next year. I'd like to remind your viewers also, while the agreement was to cut defense spending, the Republican Study Committee budget does not cut defense spending. It recognizes the important job that we have to do in Congress, which is defend our nation against bad enemies around the world, and we're going to continue to do so.
So if I could ask, where do the cuts come from other than waste, fraud, and abuse? Because I know there's a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse, but there's also some big chunks that have to be cut. And you know, the danger here is that whenever a Republican actually starts talking sense about the way our government spends money, they are under fire. I remember when Paul Ryan was throwing a grandmother in a wheelchair off a cliff. So what are the cuts, and how are you willing to politically make them work for the American people to digest?
Well, you're right. The waste, fraud, and abuse is something that likes to get thrown around a lot. But when you look at duplicative spending, one of the things that's pretty interesting about Congress that I've learned, I was 35 years in business. If a program wasn't working, you eliminated that program and started with something else that was working. That's not how it works in Congress. You just keep that program running and you just create another one to spend more money. And so there's so much of that, somewhere around $400 billion a year of that kind of spending alone. There's no, I guess you could classify as waste. As former Senator Tom Coburn always told me, is that every dollar appropriated has a constituency. And so we need to get resurrected on it. Another thing is, Larry, is we have 92 programs in America today that spends over $1 trillion a year helping those who need help, called our Social Safety Net program. I've asked the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, for accounting of that. And they said it could be somewhere around a year before I could get that information back. There's so much money going to agencies that have no idea where it goes. And by the way, this is not federal money. This is taxpayer money, and we should have the opportunity to know where it's going.
I'd love to spend the rest of our time talking about the oversight and judiciary investigations that are now launching. You mentioned Congressman Comer and Jordan. And obviously, the most present issue right now has to do with the president's mishandling of classified information. What do you think the House needs to do here in terms of the right direction to ensure for the American people that the president hasn't been sloppy with national secrets?
Well, I think that, we need to be accountable and consistent is the two words I would use, regardless of who the president in the White House is. Clearly what we're seeing right now is, this has been sitting around his garage for 6 years. And he did affirm, by the way, that his garage had been locked, which is really helpful to know. Has no idea who's seen his documents have been laying around. If it had not been for the media, we wouldn't even known that there were documents that had been done only by his private attorneys. So I think what we have to look at, the American people want it. They want to set the politics aside, make sure this nation is safe and secure, and that our, the way we do things, our means of security issues are not being lost, and that we don't give up the lives of people who are actually out there doing the work.
Yeah.
So that's what we're going to find out with Congressman Jordan and Congressman Comer.
Could we talk through the timeline for a minute? Of course, the Mar-a-Lago raid happens in August, and I got to think any former president or vice president, after that Mar-a-Lago raid, the first thing they thought was, oh my gosh, what documents are we sitting on, right? I mean, that's the natural thing to do. We're to believe that these documents weren't discovered until somebody was cleaning out an office in the Penn Biden Center in D.C., 2 days before the midterm elections, or a few days before the midterm elections. And then he immediately notified the Justice Department. Is there any reason to believe that? Is there any way that that can be proven? Because we're supposed to believe that for 4 months they just sat on this in the middle of an election campaign.
Well, you got to remember that this Democrat president is in the White House and the DOJ works for him. So hopefully we can get some people come through whistleblowers that have already been lining up on other issues to come tell the truth about what's gone on and what was discovered and when we knew it. But, the reality is I do agree with what President Trump once said, is there's way too many things being classified. I can tell you as a member of Congress, we'll go to classified briefings and we'll have already heard it in the press. And so, and then we can't confirm or deny what we saw in the classified briefings. So many times when you have heard things that are critical to messaging or to what's going on in America, you won't even go to the briefings because that would restrict you from talking about it. So again, I think President Trump had it right. We classify way too many documents out there. There are things that obviously need to be for national secrets, but some things are done for political purposes, and we need to step aside from that.
Congressman Kevin Hern of Oklahoma joining his colleagues there in the Sooner State, quoting Tom Coburn whenever possible. That's a good sign. Good things happening in Oklahoma. More to come here on O'Connor Tonight.